We are here at the center of the installation by the artist KORAKRIT Marunanondochai, No History in a Room Filled of People with Funny Names. As you will see when you visit the exhibition, it is a fully immersive environment, sculpture, nature, and cinema. KORAKRIT is a young artist, born in 1986 in Thailand, and until recently was living between the United States, New York, and Bangkok in Thailand. His work moves in many directions: performance, film, as you can see behind me, painting, sculpture. So he's in many ways, for me, one of the perfect embodiment of what it means to be an artist today. At the beginning of the 20th century, he's moving from one discipline to the other, from one continent to the other. His work has been shown, has been exhibited over the last, I would say, 5 years, if not a little bit more, all over the world, in museums, in art centers, from Los Angeles to Venice, Italy, where he recently took part into the Venice Bienal. The way KORAKRIT Marunanondochai works is very much a collective way. Very often surrounds himself with a community of like-minded artists coming from different disciplines. For instance, in this work, KORAKRIT has collaborated with the performer, the dancer, boy child, whom you see on the screen many times, actually on the right screen of the triptych, the video triptych that we have, but also the face of boy child is at the center of this tomb-like burial ground sculpture that you have when you enter the exhibition. And by doing that, I think there is also something that there is a way of working that you can actually trace within the history of art, and maybe also from a period of time in the history of contemporary art when the pure notion of authorship was challenged. In many ways, the work of KORAKRIT makes me think of the work of an American artist who was very active in the 70s and 1980s. His name was Paul Thek. And Paul Thek's work was about the centrality of the body, about sculpture, about installation, and Paul Thek was working with a community, almost with a tribe of artists that would follow him and take part in the installation, the conception of his work. His work, Paul Thek, was very ritualistic, and we can see that it's also somehow part of KORAKRIT's work. His work was political. It was about the sexual liberation of the time. It was also about the cruelty of war and of history in many ways, and the inability or the impossibility of an artist to be outside of history. And in many ways, this installation by KORAKRIT reminds me of this moment in history and the practice of someone like Paul Thek, but other artists could actually come to mind. In terms of his collaborator, it's also very important to mention the person who was also a key figure in this work, Alex GVOJIC, who is a filmmaker, a cinematographer, and has been collaborating for a few years now with KORAKRIT, and was behind the images that you see in the film installation, which is part of No History. So what do you see when you enter this room? First, you see a stuffed rabbit. Feel free to interpret the stuffed rabbit the way you want. It could be the artist, but you will see also, spending time in the installation, that KORAKRIT has, or at least in this installation, there is a bestiary of animals, and the role of animals, and we'll talk a little bit about that, is actually quite precise. But the rabbit is also an animal that lives in the underground, and the notion of underground is not foreign to what's happening in this room. And more than underground, I would say the notion of underworld, real or mythological, is part of the work. So when you pass the rabbit, the first thing you'll see, you are about to see it with your feet, because the first element of this experience is the floor. KORAKRIT transforms the floor of the gallery of Serralves Room 5 by bringing nature, by bringing the earth, bringing soil into the room, turning the room into a cave. So when you enter Room 5, you're basically entering a cave. You're entering somehow the underworld. Then, in this underworld, in this moment of nature, you will face this tomb-like sculpture where the face of boy child is coming out of this bush, of these trees, surrounded by rays of green laser reaching to the ceiling and shooting through the room, almost creating a fake ceiling. But the ray also has a metaphorical meaning there. Then you pass the sculpture and you will see this triptych of video projection at the center of the room. On these three screens, you have different elements that are key to understand the meaning of no history in a room filled of people with funny names. And these three aspects are really the core in terms of content of the room. The first one, you will see footage of KORAKRIT family members, his elders, that are being cared for by other people, suggesting the passage of time, different ages of life, and eventually the transition from one moment of life to another. But with this notion of care, you also have the notion of human empathy, which is very present in his work. What is the kind of transaction, of transmission that happened when one cares for someone else? Another element appeared in another screen of the triptych, landscapes, footage from landscape in Thailand, where the film was shot, and it was shot in an area of Thailand that was key during the 1960s South Asian wars led by the United States. This place or places between Thailand and Laos that were key strategic location. Then you see footages of, and you might remember this event a few years ago when kids football team got trapped in a cave, like you are in, which access filled up with water, and this team was unable actually to leave this underworld, and it took an incredible international effort to get them out of the cave and save their life. It's another aspect of this work that can directly be a reference to the notion of care for each other or for empathy that was also in the first part of the movie that I just described. Then on the other screen, you have footage of different performances by the performer, the artist, Boyle Child. And in these performances, you almost have the feeling that the body of Boyle Child is going from one stage to the other, that it is an endlessly transitioning, transforming body. So when you have all that together, you have different elements that constitute a work that brings together elements of biography, of recent history, of more quote-unquote ancient history, and elements that almost transcend this history and bring these histories of present or recent past in a mythological dimension. And the notion of mythology here, I think, is really important because I believe that what KORAKRIT is doing with this installation, with his collaborators, Boyle-Child and Alex, is actually not writing the history of our present, but actually inventing a mythology for our own time, for our present. He is inspired, because of his roots, by Asian mythology, Thai mythology, keeping in mind that all of that get interference with his upbringing and his studies in the United States. But for instance, you have images or footage on the video of snakes. Snakes in Asian mythology, in Thai mythology, in mythology from Laos or Indonesia is the figure of the naga. And the naga is these snakes. So when you see a snake around a Buddha, or when you see a snake on an element of architecture, it's a reference to this almost universal naga mythological figure. And the naga is also a transformative body. It's a body that passes from one stage to the other, from life to death, from the world to the underworld. So this installation here that refers to history is almost this moment of passage from one world to the other. It's extremely ritualistic as well. You will see that in the film there are these performances organized and written by KORAKRIT that are almost cult-like, ritualistic, like cathartic. And by cathartic, I mean by, again, bringing you from one stage of life to the other. And thus the figure you have when you enter the gallery, this corpse, which is there on the floor, surrounded by nature. It's unclear, or it's clear, it's up to you if this is a corpse or a body, from which you have this transcending green light that is appearing and structuring the room. The green light is a little bit like the Naga character. It becomes a body that enters the entire room. The green light also, for me, could be a different kind of reference. The Green Light is a very famous film by the French filmmaker Éric Rohmer that was itself using as sources a novel by the writer Jules Verne in this novel, The Green Light, Le Rayon Vert, when you would see the green light in the sky that would reveal the world to you. You would start to see the world differently. Or you start to perceive the way other people perceive the world. So there is, in this green light, coming out of the body of Boyle-Child at the entrance of the exhibition, this transformative element, this moment of revelation that I think this installation is about.